It's ad break time. I'm proud to announce that the Beyond Solitaire podcast is sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. At this very moment, Greg Loring Albright's Keep the Faith is crowdfunding on BackerKit. It's a light RPG about the evolution of a new religion, and I wrote the curriculum guide for it, so you already know I think it's great. Also, there will be a gameplay stream on February 17th from 8 to 10 p.m. EST. That's tonight if you're listening on launch day. Check it out to see the game in action. I did put a link in the show notes. And speaking of streams, Laine, Nooney, my guest for this episode, wants you to know that there is also a ROM chip fundraiser going on with a stream full of fun and mischief scheduled for February 22nd from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. EST. And that is this Saturday. So if you want to support a publication about game history, here's your chance. And for now, let's get on with the show. Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and today on the podcast I have a very special guest. This is Laine Nooney. They're associate professor in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU, but I'm having them on because they're a game historian. How you doing, Laine?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm delighted to talk to you because I just finished your book, The Apple II Age, How Computing Became Personal.
Cringe. All right.
So for people who don't know what that is, do you want to give the quick blurb so I can get a sense of where we're starting from?
Sure. So this was it's my first book. It came out in 2023 from the University of Chicago Press, The Apple II Age, How the Computer Became Personal. And maybe one way of describing the book is saying it's my attempt to answer, like, how did a consumer software market in the United States even happen? How did it become a thing that one day, circa 1980, you could walk into a store and buy software? And so the way I decided to slice that historical problem was by looking at the Apple II in particular for a number of reasons that we could talk about. I think it's like kind of a perfect case study for doing an industry analysis. And yeah, so it tells, primarily the book is focused on telling the sort of emergence and development and industrialization of different software categories like business, games, utilities, education, home productivity, stuff like that.
So, were any of the reasons you chose the Apple II as a case study personal? Because since I mentioned reading this book, people are like, oh, I had one. I played it as a kid.
No. And like old school Apple guys will always they'll be like, you look too young to have been. And you're like, you're right, sir. My first computer was a Tandy in the probably 1990, I think is when I got it. Maybe 92. I had a very old, like mid 80s system. I never used an Apple II myself. And I think that's, there's lots to be said for different ways of approaching computer history, and the experience of the personal is one of them. But I actually think the fact that I had no preconceptions, no nostalgia, I was just like, what is this thing? Allowed me to take a look at it in a way that I think has hindered the way some histories have been done around this object previously.
So what did make the Apple II emerge for you as the computer to spend time studying? Like, how did you even come across? I didn't even know it was a real thing,
So there's basically kind of two reasons, or maybe there's a nest of reasons really, but I'm going to start with two and see where we go. The first is that the Apple II had the largest software library of any computer of this, what we might call the second wave of microcomputers era. So that begins roughly 1977. The Apple II is released in the same year alongside the TRS-80 and the Commodore PET. And that goes through until about 1984 when we get like the Macintosh, and then we have a very different paradigm for what quote unquote personal computing is going to look like. And for me, all the action is between 1977 and 1984. This is when the idea of a home computer industry and a home computer software industry really is invented, like concretizes, develops all its supply chains, and hardens into something that sustains basically until software ceases to, like, becomes digital, right? Until it's all just like shit you download off the cloud or whatever. And so because of that, with the Apple II, you got the broadest range of software possibilities, right? And a lot of this, I document this pretty closely in the book. A lot of this has to do with like the very interesting kind of like technical way that the technology of the Apple II itself, the way its hardware was designed and configured, allowed it to be like this very robust system. There was kind of two categories for computers back then, which was like the idea of a personal computer, which was actually intended as an office computer, which was like high powered but kind of snoozy. It was not the kind of system you would necessarily play games on. They usually didn't have color monitors and stuff like that. Or you had cheap seats home computers like the Commodore PET, maybe the TRS-80. Certainly like the Commodore 64 is the best example of something like that, where it's really kind of a game focused system in many ways. And the Apple II is really kind of like rode this interesting line where it could be a full service business computer. It could totally do, you could balance your checkbook on it at home and your kids could play games on it at night. It kind of fit all the different market categories. So if you're trying to understand, like, if you're trying to look for the densest possible archive, right, the Apple II left behind the biggest trace. And so the second part of this is that there was a specific magazine dedicated to Apple people, like Apple enthusiasts in the early 80s, called Soft Talk. And it ran from 1980 to 1984. It was very unique. It was co-founded by a woman named Margot Comstock. And they had this like really big letters to the editor section. Like they would publish dozens and dozens of letters, and it just gives you a really rich sense of like what people were doing with their computers. They were also the first and kind of most accurate magazine to run sales rankings. So there was just a lot of data left behind about the Apple II because it played such a unique role in the market.
That's really, really interesting. Okay,
sorry, that was such a long answer.
No, I like long answers. It means less work for me. So
Yap. That's all I do.
So, okay, there's two directions I want to take this. But I'm going to start with the one that I think is likely to dead end a little bit sooner, which is one of the things I thought about your book was the most interesting was that you talk a lot about like the education market for software, but it sounds to me like that's something that did not organically exist. It was almost like somebody just wanted to make computers educational in order to sell more computers.
So what do you mean by organically?
I guess what I mean is is this driven by, parents who actually want to purchase computers for their children, expect them to learn from it? Or is this something that businesses are inventing as a product that people didn't realize they needed and now they'll go and buy them?
Yeah, so it's these questions of kind of like, it's not quite chicken or egg, but it's like, where does the desire for product come from, right? Where does it originate? And in the education is it's the last chapter of the book. And so each of these chapters that's on a specific software category, I tell both kind of a general story of how that category emerges and how people define it. And you could imagine, like, how do we define what is quote unquote educational was not self-evident at this time. But I also tell that story kind of up against telling the history of a specific piece of software. And in this chapter, I talk about a piece of software called Snooper Troops that was developed by a guy named Tom Snyder. It was published by a company called Spinnaker, which was an entirely like venture capital invented software category. And as far as I can tell from looking at that, it was sort of like there was a widespread anxiety around a kind of like keeping up with the changing economic state of the world that inspired a lot of people to buy computers. Once we're out of like there's different generations of people interested in computers, right? There's sort of like the hobbyist people who are already sold and they're kind of their first adopters, right? They're gonna, they're interested, they buy them immediately. And then you have people who are kind of like interested in this thing that is the quote unquote future, right? We can make lots of parallels to that in our present moment. And so they kind of are attracted to these technologies, don't really understand them, but like bring them into the home or trying to make use of them. And there was a lot of anxiety at the time, particularly about the kind of flagging state of the American education system. Um, and so I would say that these impulses came from different places. It was absolutely the case that parents bought computers, often thinking that somehow exposure to a computer was enough to like teach their children about computing. And that is obviously not true, especially in the early 80s. And so, and this is somewhat documented that parents walk into software stores and they're like, do you have anything for my child? And that software market was like really weird, very decentralized, very scattered, and often not very interesting. And so in the case study I look at, basically these venture capitalists did a bunch of surveys with retailers, and they were like, what is the number one software people want? And they were like, people are always asking me for education software and I have nothing to sell them. And so they're like, great, we're going to make education software. and so that just becomes a thing. But education's a weird category because there's also like companies that are making software just to sell to schools, not to sell to a consumer market. I would say that like education, more than other categories, was more top down. It was more something like created by, because you also kind of had to wait for computers to be adopted by a broader, have a broader user base than the very. It's weird, like in terms of the computer market, what that looked like 1980, 1981 is like really different from what it looked like 1983, 1984. And I think to most people, the distinction in those years are pretty non-existent. But when you're studying these very early kind of micro movements in how attitudes and opinions and desires around technology shift, there was rapid transformation just in the span of that period of time.
That's really interesting. I think I figured out why I was so curious about this while you were talking about it in the book. And it's so I very, very recently left a career as a high school teacher. And I got out during the era of the rise of AI in classrooms. And now even now when I'm out of the classroom, I feel like everything I open is offering me an AI product that I did not ask for.
Yeah.
And I guess I was wondering if like, is this like something that just tech has always done?
Yeah, I mean, they're looking for porous markets. So one, there are definitely the case that like within education, there are people who want to enhance, like sincerely, genuinely want to enhance the learning experience for their students. They're excited about new technology. I know deep in my footnotes, there's references to, there are media studies scholars who've looked at the introduction of media into the classroom going back to the early 20th century. So like, we have had these conversations about slide projectors and televisions in the classroom, and like, what is it? The idea of like, what does it mean to use media to make learning more rich, right, or more immersive or more experiential? And what I think you see really accelerate around the computer is that it plays into, I think, this very genuine interest that many educators have to make learning as exciting as possible for their students. But it gets kind of, this is such an easy game for technology executives, right? And it's about cutting contracts with states, and school districts, right? It's about like two bureaucrats in a room, pardon my language, like jerking each other off, right? And so what this kind of really becomes, one guy promising another guy a pack of lies so that he can score a deal that like gets his company through the next quarter, right? And that set of impulses is really almost entirely disconnected from the impulses of like a teacher who wants to make learning cooler or more interesting or expose their students to the cutting edge, right? This stuff is not being driven by teachers, and this stuff is not being created by teachers, right? And I think we're feeling that really acutely right now, where there's all of these just like top down, raining garbage slop AI tools now being like, I open PowerPoint and it wants to make a fucking PowerPoint for me. It's like, you don't even know what I'm trying to do, Phil Salvador at the Video Game History Foundation asked PowerPoint to make a slide deck about my journal ROM chip, and he sent it to me. It was like this stuff is just like so wildly stupid. you
Yeah,
know?
I had to go to a training before I left where there's like Magic AI is going to generate questions for you as a teacher. And I was like, okay, do me some questions about Roman history. And it asked me, it was like, who was the first emperor of Rome? Julius Caesar, like a patently incorrect fact, just wrong. And she was like, you just gotta like, you gotta correct it. So I spent the whole rest of the time pretending that I'd done bad things in my classroom and making it write me fake apology letters because there's just nothing else to
Yeah, I mean, it really becomes. I mean, I have a lot to say about ChatGPT tools, and I've used them pretty extensively myself. But you do spend a lot. You can easily spend as much time trying to get it to do the thing correctly or close to correctly as it takes to like do it. Just do it yourself, you know. And so I think that what we're seeing is precisely that kind of capital impulse. Is like, right, it's all, I think it's all about back end contracts, right? Like this stuff coming into schools, it's all about these kind of hidden economies that are what are actually siphoning resources out of our education systems and into the pocketbooks of, you know, all of these like kind of dipshit AI startups, which absolutely a bunch of them are good. This bubble's going to pop, right? Because it's way too expensive for way too little ROI. But where a lot of these things do find stable forms of revenue is in education and government contracting. And so that I feel like that's like actually like such a smoking gun of how technology reinforces the idea that it's essential. Because once you have a generation of children trained on something, or once you make all the entry level data entry workers at a company use a certain tool, then we're cooked, right? Then we have to take this stuff up, even when it isn't as useful or is incredibly problematic, or, right? Like, there's the economic power has a lot of control to make this stuff become a foregone conclusion when it doesn't have to be. And that's what's like really a bummer.
So, okay, you're a media teacher. You teach computers. How do you teach this to your students and also live and I guess kind of study it at the same time? Like, how does this feel for you as somebody who's actually dealing with this on both sectors?
Yeah, so I mean, so in my department, I mostly teach undergrads. I teach like they don't need someone running a PhD level computer history class every year. So I teach two classes primarily. I teach a really big 240 person history of media and communication lecture, where we start with fire and we end with Google search. AI is not a thing I deal with in that class yet, as a content topic.
Right.
And then I teach a 50-person class called Video Game Economies, that's about the political economy of the game industry, right? And so those classes are kind of, is this about like how I teach this as content or how I deal with AI in my classrooms?
I actually kind of wanted to know both because I mean, you're in a
Yeah.
situation where it would actually be both instead of, please don't use this to translate Latin for yourself.
Yeah. So I think that in terms of content, one of the things, regardless of what I'm talking about, one of the things I'm always focusing on is like, where is economic power in any and where is it held in the development and proliferation of any medium, right? Who does it benefit? It benefit for who, right? Like, power for who is always the question. And this gets very tactile in my video game economies class, where, I actually force them to learn what is the revenue split at Steam, right? What is the revenue split of Twitch? How is it that like Twitch bits get created as a way for Twitch to basically like siphon off what were previously PayPal donations so that they can take a cut? And when you map this out for them, they're kind of like, oh shit, right? And it's sort of modeling a way of thinking, which is stop like not like the idea they have about how things make money, and I'm making air quotes right now, is often very, very shallow when they show up, right? They're like, I pay, $3 to an app, and like they have no idea where it goes, who gets it, how these things are determined, the way that those cuts shape markets. And so I'm always asking a question about like, where is economic power operating in any kind of media interaction, right? From like the platforms we buy games on to view them on to whatever. In terms of my own classroom, I'm somewhat fortunate in that I've been on sabbatical this academic year, and so I have not had to deal with the brunt of this. I think that, and it would intersect with my classes in very different ways. I mean, I think that I'm maintaining a policy that ultimately, like, one, you can ban it, but some of them are like, there's always going to be students on the fringe who decide to use it. You know, I think there's a few. I mean, I think one thing that I'm going to do in my big intro class is I'm going to dedicate a little lecture to it, and I'm going to ask them a basic question, which is like, what's the difference between a search engine and generative AI? And I can guarantee you they cannot answer that question. They do not know, right? We have so fully obfuscated how this technology works, and we have so abandoned them in the world of digital literacy at earlier grade levels that they really don't know what a search engine is. They don't know how the internet works. They don't know how it was developed. I mean, the whole back third of my history of media and communication class is a history of computing. So I teach them like where the internet comes from, what the difference between the internet and the World Wide Web is, what makes a web page, and why that's different from like what you're doing on Discord. All of this stuff, right? They treat it with a certain degree of magic because it's never been technologically explained to them. And I do think digital literacy in this nation is like really poor. And I think that's like failing in very, very early kind of educational levels. You know, I can't quite speak to like what policies I'm going to make.
Yeah, sure.
You know, and part of it is you're trying to design assignments that are harder for ChatGPT. You know, I will never do reading responses, right? That's a recipe for having an AI spit something out, right? But really emphasizing and requiring research, but also teaching them like why research is important. Like many of them do not know that ChatGPT isn't basing what they write on things that are stated on the internet, right? They think it's like going and finding stuff that's true, and like they don't know it's just a probabilistic word generator, you know?
Yeah.
So making that like clear, really requiring use of external sources in various assignments, right? That kind of stuff can kind of hem against, or at least make it more identifiable when something has been plagiarized or created by chat. And I will have no mercy for that. Like that's like auto F, and like you have been, you know, sent off to the, you know, for an academic integrity violation, right? I think we all have to be responsible for the work that we submit. Right.
Fair enough. All right. So back down the other pathway. You mentioned magazines, and you mentioned kind of like a greater body of evidence for the Apple II when you decided to write about it. So what kind of evidence are we talking about? Like, what is still around from these computers of the 80s and before? And how do you access it for research?
Yeah, so this book, did you read a note on archives in the back of the book?
I did. I'm just making you expand on it because I'm really interested.
Okay. So you're just teeing me up. I see. So this book, I wrote it during COVID, and so that's kind of shaped certain, I think there's decisions I would have made if that had not been the case. I might have tried more to look into like internal documentation at Apple or anything, but like at the end of the day, Apple isn't going to let me see shit inside of their company. And so I kind of set aside the idea that this would in any way, that this really had to be, I really had to work with and determine historical knowledge from what was available. And like a crap ton of what I used was from the Internet Archive. And so, which has like pretty replete scans of a slew of major and minor periodicals from the period, as well as a lot of handbooks, instruction manuals, market catalogs. You know, it's one of those things where if you know what you're looking for, I mean, the Internet Archive often, I think, you know, if you're unexperienced in a certain historical period, it all just looks like a big dump of information. But if you know exactly what you're trying to find, my ability to like find a historical claim in one magazine and then use very specific keywording to find something in another, like I know the year that this should be appearing, I think I know the issue, can I find it, and actually to locate it, and we're looking at everything from advertisements to letters to the editor to editorials. Any moment where someone is speaking for the magazine is really interesting, because these magazines are also cultural actors, right? Like there is a person in charge of them. There is, editorial staff, and they are making decisions, and those decisions are kind of declaring certain positions. I think this comes up most clearly in my chapter about utilities, where I focus on the software product Locksmith, which was a bit copier, right? It was right. Software that allowed you to break copyright protection on a piece on a floppy disk, so that you can make what was considered an unauthorized duplication. And it was wild kind of chasing that through the archive, because a whole bunch of magazines refused. So they refused to run advertisements like that. It was very interesting. There was like a kind of periodical boycott of doing advertisements for that software, because it was considered to endanger the software market. But they produced so much other discourse about that decision that like the history of that software becomes not about its releases or how much it sold or its popularity, because that was all impossible to track. There's no residue. But instead, it's like, what is all of these companies are literally writing letters to each other. They're making statements where they refer to the editors in other magazines. And you could kind of like web that together to understand the particular kind of economic pressures that these magazines were operating in and this software was existing in, right? Like, how do you write a history of a software that kind of wasn't supposed to exist, right? And that's one of the puzzles of that. So yeah, it was dominantly, I was really fortunate that there has been so much work by enthusiasts and hobbyists to get those documents scanned. I'm a good friend of Jason Scott's. He has been an intrepid kind of research assistant for me. And then I also have like a pretty extensive personal library of materials. Particularly, I've spent years kind of buying books and guides that were published off of like Amazon or eBay, usually just for a couple bucks, that were published in the late 70s through the mid 80s. That really they were published like intended for consumers during that time period. And those things give you really interesting like portraits of like how a case is being made about why you should own a computer, what kind of things you want to look for. It allows you to understand how consumer values were conceptualized at that time. It's a whole array of like mostly front-facing documents, but I think if you know what you're doing, you can get a really rich story out of them.
That's really interesting. I also noticed one of the things you were very persistent about, both in terms of verbalizing it and actually doing it throughout the book, was trying to avoid some of the mythologizing that happens around Apple in particular. Is that something that was challenging to do, or did you just have a blast bypassing all of the time that Steve Jobs had to concoct a story?
Yeah, I think that, whenever you decide you're going to write about Apple, you are kind of putting a target on your back, right? This is probably the most mythologized computing company in the world, right? I think we could fairly safely say that, at least in terms of how long it's existed, right? Which is, longer than any other at this point. And I do this, I think, I do it throughout the book, but it was a really interesting, specific challenge for me as a historian in the second chapter of the book, where I decided, when I finally admitted, Laine, you're kind of writing a history about Apple, you kind of have to tell people like what was happening at Apple, or you're writing a history of the Apple II, you kind of have to explain like how this thing came to exist. And I was like, fine, I'm going to write a chapter that tries to rewrite the origin story of Apple. Right, which is a story that has been told 100 times by all sorts of like famous men, journalists and authors, and there's a ton of mythologization about how this thing is made. And for me, it was actually, I feel like capital H historians might see the chapter as a little unnecessary, because it's not doing the same thing the rest of the book was, but I really wanted the exercise of telling this story in a way that does not make these men, and by these men I'm dominantly referring to Wozniak and Jobs, but also Mike Markkula, who was their first investor, that does not make them larger than life, that really tries to understand how the kind of unique and what I think some people sometimes experienced as larger to life qualities these people had, right? Whether it was like Wozniak's phenomenal genius level capacity for engineering, right?
Right.
Or Jobs's kind of weird, this like kind of this way he was able to tap into certain kind of like cultural instincts, and also he was like a real squeaky dealer. He had that kind of this ability to kind of like convince anybody that they could, like he had such a like force of attention, right? That he could get through situations that like other people probably couldn't. And I really tried to like contextualize that, right? So I was like, first of all, with Wozniak, we have to talk about like where he's born, which is he's born in like the valley in the 1960s, which is like has a higher population density of engineers than any other place in the world, right? If there was a place that was going to make a Steve Wozniak, this was it. And so it's about trying to account for, it's like, I don't want to take anything away from this man. He was truly brilliant. But we have to understand what is it that allowed that brilliance to grow and to thrive, right? And there you're beginning to try and account for the other kind of context. So there's a geographic context that's there, right? He's also he's living in the middle of a whole bunch of really important computer companies. He's down the road from Stanford. He's down the road from Berkeley, right? These are all places that are kind of like available to him as a young, as a boy, kind of obsessed with and interested in computers that allow his impulses to grow. Would someone in rural Kansas be able to do the same thing? Absolutely not. Right. And so we have to talk about it. Right. And like, pulling that down and really trying to set a scene about how much the culture that he was in like enabled him for these particular personality characteristics to thrive. And I think Jobs is also a version of that story in a very different way. And so it's like, it's kind of a figure ground reversal. We tend to tell the stories of these men as if everything that happened behind them was just a backdrop. And it's like, no, it's a context, right? And you have to situate them in that. There is no such thing as being larger to life. We're all historically bound, right? And you have to kind of make account for all of the and so that includes accounting for things like the way that gender and race intersect to make certain kinds of possibilities available to you that would not have been available to other people. And just saying that is factual, right? And it really should not be controversial. It's wild that like there's a subset of men on my Amazon posts who have like gone off about the fact that I just identify the race of Steve Wozniak. I'm like, you all really need to calm down. like they're so horny for someone to worship that they can't, that it actually like mentally blocks them from being able to actually like do historical study. It's kind of why it's like you're watching kind of like whiteness and patriarchy operate in those moments, right? It literally makes you stupider. But that was figuring out that was a challenge I took on at the level of like the sentence, of the word structure. It was really intentional, and I was always trying, because I didn't want to, especially with Wozniak, who was still a living individual, right? And it was very good to me. He gave me private photos. He was super sweet to me. You want to both account for a person's like the fullness of who they are, and the fact that they did make choices, right? Everything wasn't preordained. There is, they earned the things that they did. but there's also a context in which that happens, and you have to backfill that, right? And it's
Right.
a really delicate balance, and I think it's one of nobody talks about that chapter, and I think it's like one of my proudest parts of the book. Uh, you know, like to retell the story. I use all the same materials everybody else does, and I come to a really different set of conclusions about what was going on at this time.
Nice. So I'm glad we got to talk about that then. But so this also makes me, I've just been kind of like listening, and this is just such an interesting book process. But it also, as I was reading it, before I started reading the book, I'd watched your 2017 GDC talk about
Whew, going
preserving
back.
the history of game. Yeah, you're still in Georgia, which I have also escaped from now. But you were talking about your concerns about the difficulty of preserving gaming and technological history, what we could do about it. And I kind of feel like your book is kind of a start to solving your own problem and like answering your own concerns. Did you see it that way at the time? Like, were you already looking at it then?
I mean, I don't know if I was. I think a lot of what was informing my understanding of game history, of like game history and preservation at that point in 2017, was the book that ultimately now has wound up will be my second book, which is a book that focused on the history of Sierra Online, where I had done this is the company that made King's Quest, Leisure Suit Larry, Space, a lot of quests. If you have ever sneezed and heard of a graphical adventure game, they made it, most likely. And I had spent years doing really comprehensive oral history, dragging documents out of people's basements. Like, this entire office is actually filled with stuff that people have just given me that never made it to an archive. And I think one of my real impulses in that talk was like, so much video game preservation conversation. And I do think this is getting better, but like, especially when it hits in like mainstream press, is that they just think it's about games. And I'm like, bitch, I don't care about a game. Like, I almost never talk about a game, right? Even in the Apple II book, like I like there's things to do, like game history. I like the part of my argument is to take the game out of game history and see what's left behind, right? And this idea that we have to focus all of our energy on making sure that like every Kirby game is preserved, or else we will not know the grand history and legacy of this medium. It's like, bitch, history will survive. Like you can miss some things, like it's okay, and that's just what history is, and we're flexible about that, and it's cool, and you don't like. It's not just about the cultural product, because the game itself tells you almost nothing about how it was produced, right? Like, they can't speak for themselves. And a history of games that's nothing but games is like dumb, like there's just no way that it can actually connect what games are to our larger economic, geopolitical, and social and cultural circumstances. And so for that, we need all the stuff around games. And so I think part of my pitch there was like, stop just talking about games. Stop thinking that things being online means they're saved, right? I think we all kind of know this better now, but I think in 2017, there was still this kind of, I think that belief was a little more predominant. And I came out of there kind of like, you know what I need you to do, folks? I need you to put your shit in a box. That was the thesis of the talk, was just like, print some stuff out, develop your photos. My God, put them in a box. It can be kind of random. It doesn't have to be complete. It doesn't, when I go through the materials that I work with, I have, 2 pieces of paper from a design document from 1985, I have a org chart from like 1 month in 1987, and I can make meaning of that, right? I don't need a perfect map of the world, right? We can work with what we have, but we need some stuff to that's what's cool about paper, is that it sustains in this interesting way. Like because if I can get enough of it, I can actually begin to, like, a good historian can tell a story with that. So we have to get rid of this idea actually of completionism in terms of a historical record. No historian works with a complete record set. And I think like it was kind of a case for materiality as well, that like you have, I do this thing every year when I go to GDC, which is I walk the aisles of the showroom floor and I pick up a piece of ephemera from every table I can get. And I put them in a big envelope. They're right over there in a corner, and they're labeled by year. I think someone at the Strong Museum does this as well, and I think Phil Salvador usually does this too. Like, we're the people up there like trying to take a flyer, but like, no, I do not want to talk to you about your like waterfall ad analytics company. Thanks. Like, but we're like, that's one of the few places where materials about what the industry looked like still exist. And so when when like our floor map becomes digitized, right, and we don't get a physical program anymore, or right, like when all this stuff moves into the cloud, there's no way to strip it back out. And I think historians, as we move forward as a discipline, are going to have to come up with kind of like quirkier and quirkier ideas about how we do this. And I think my book is kind of an example of that. I think there's a lot of the idea of trying to tell like a user-facing story without ever talking to a user, or even deciding that this is a story that I'm going to tell not by talking about the company, but by talking about like all of the cultural production around it, is kind of a new thing. I would say it's in computer history, or is like part of a trend for how we account for these technologies in a context where traditional institutional and industrial archives are not going to be accessible to us. You can still access IBM's archive, right? I think that, until it burned down, Hewlett Packard had an archive. Like, Apple, never going to let you in. Never. Microsoft, I might be able to get in there only because I know people who work fairly high up in, but like to do real historical research in those spaces, good fucking luck. It's not going to happen, So you have to have other techniques.
So as things go to the cloud and materiality is lost, your original thesis was put it in a box, but now there's nothing to put in a box.
Yeah.
So now what?
I think one of the ideas I come up with is like, could you print out your Slack? Like I'm just like rogue solutions, guys. I once interviewed a man who had worked at Sierra in the late 90s, and I met him in Seattle, and it was a very funny conversation. I go to this guy's house and I sit down at a table, and he goes, "I always knew someday someone would come," and I was like, "Okay."
It was like the end of the last crusade. Like,
yeah, he had saved all of these paper documents, but also he slid a USB key across the table and he said, "This is all my email." And I was like, "Are you fucking?" And I could still open it in Outlook, because ultimately the files are basically still the same, right? Right? It doesn't quite look right or whatever, but like I could read it, which was nuts. Obviously that is not necessarily, it's harder and harder to do that kind of externalization, but like, I don't know, I downloaded my Facebook archive several years ago, right? Plenty of people have their Instagram archives downloaded. You can extract your mail. I'm not saying that like every person has to do all of this, but I don't need a lot of people to have done it in order. Like, I got one guy's email. I'm going to do a lot with that, and so, it is kind of a, I think some people have a sensibility about it, whether that comes from a place of mental wellness or not. Like, doesn't really matter to me. But yeah, it's really challenging, which is why I think like, finding material stuff wherever we can is essential. Right, one day all these Substacks are going to be gone, all these fucking Patreons are going to be gone, and this kind of I'm not really answering your question about what do we do, and it's like basically it sounds like what I'm saying is all you need is a small group of weirdos, And it's like,
And
that's a lot of history is going to come down to that, right? It's a small group of weirdos just doing their best. Yeah. I have an assignment in my video game economies class where it's actually secretly to do this. In that class, each student has to write a 1,200 word encyclopedia entry about something related to the game industry in the present. And the point is for them to create kind of a catalog of like what are companies that exist right now that definitely aren't going to exist in 10 years, right? Like there's already, like in that, there's companies that are already shut down, platforms that have been sold, stuff that if they're like whatever coverage is of it has only ever existed in sites like Gamma Sutra or GameIndustry.biz. And so I'm trying to get them to like collect it there. And the whole thing lives on the Internet Archive. You can search for it there. With the intention of it being a resource for future historians, right? There's kind of, there's rogue solutions like that. You hope that enough of it will make it forward into the timeline that we'll be able to do something with it.
So you mentioned mostly using, paper sources, material sources that are left behind around these items.
Or that have been scanned, fortunately. And
yeah. But do interviews have much of a place in your research? Because I feel like, the 70s, I mean, I've been able to talk, with my friend Fred on our wargame archaeology videos to people who were like getting wargame magazines in the 60s and stuff like that. And so how are you handling, I guess, oral history, and how are you parsing it? I mean, a document has its own sort of like true snapshot reflection of the time that it was made in versus now, like you're looking at people who are still alive who are looking back over their past and talking to you about it. So how are you collecting it, and then how are you assessing it?
Sure. So oral history has been a huge part of my prior practice. You don't see it as strongly in the Apple II book. There are a few interviews I do there with specifically the guys who made Print Shop, Dan Balsam and Marty Kahn. And I did an interview with Tom Snyder. But for the Sierra project, I have interviewed, I think now, close to 60 people from the factory floor to the C-suite across about a 25-year time span. And that was a project I started kind of right as I graduated from my PhD in 2014, precisely because the archival backend of Sierra Online was so absent. There was nothing. If you go to so technically the Strong Museum of Play, which is, this great archive up in northern New York, the biggest game-related archive in the country. They have the quote-unquote Ken and Roberta Williams collection there. Ken and Roberta, who founded Sierra Online, donated their stuff to the Strong. If you go up there, man, it's like fucking useless. Like it's like there's no internal documentation. It is such a reflection of Ken Williams's as a manager that it's like boxes of awards and plaques. He saved like the nameplate from his door, and I'm like, there's a lot I can do with this historically, but none of it explains how this company operated, right? It's a front facing, it was kind of like their memory box, and they gave it to the Strong, and that's great. But it's like, if I want to understand the labor operations and all of that, I need different techniques. And that was where I turned to oral history. Sierra was a really interesting case. It ran out of a small town in kind of the Sierra Nevadas in Central California. And because of that, a lot of the people they hired were locals. And because of that, also, when the company left and eventually shut down, a lot of those locals stayed. So they were still there. And so I have been able to go to that town, Oakhurst, and do pretty extensive oral history. I was able to follow it up to Seattle. I've done a bunch of oral history there. And then I've chased down people at a variety of, some people wound up spinning off into other professions, but oral history, it has a different relationship to truthiness, quote unquote, right? We can, we have, of course, material documents aren't always accurate, right? And they reflect their own conditions of production, and you can find dates wrong on things all the time, like that. That's nothing new. But once you're in oral history, you are in the domain of memory for sure. And I think this is also one of the beefs I have with a lot of the way game history, particularly kind of like popular or mainstream game history gets done, is that people think, one, talking with people produces an accurate record. It doesn't. And they also think that when you want to know the history of a company, you go to the person at the top. And what I have to say is that everything I've learned about the history of capitalism and business is that is absolutely not true. The people at the top have no idea what's going on more than one or two stacks down on the org chart. You want to know what was happening at a company? Talk to the person who was like taping up boxes on the factory floor. Talk to your like customer service reps, right? If you want to know like what mattered at a company. And this idea we have, it's similar to the kind of way that it's about putting people on pillars. And we might call it hagiography, turning these technology entrepreneurs or business leaders into their own kind of saints. And that when we do that, when we treat them as if they have some kind of superior or more encompassing knowledge, we actually block off all of this other like really useful intel, right? And so my tactics have been a very, someone at the top can tell me what it's like to be at the top. And that's really all they can tell me. I interviewed Ken and Roberta last, right? And I was prepared to write the book without ever talking to them. They reached out to me. I was very surprised. I finally was annoying enough to all these other people that they knew that they contacted me. I think it was actually Roberta watched a talk I gave that was on YouTube, and she was like, I'll talk to you. And I was like, cool. I don't require that. Like, you're not going to, when I went and talked to them, my feeling was like, there's nothing you're going to tell me that's going to blow this wide open, right? I have talked to so many of your employees. I have such a pretty thorough understanding of what happened. All I'm going to get is your perspective. And that's all oral history is, right? It's someone's like obviously inherently subjective point of view. Serious historians do not treat these documents as if they produce like capital T truth.
Right.
One of the things we pay attention to is that, or one of the things I often say is how a person remembers something is often more important than what they remember, right? When the energy of how they speak to me or the way that they characterize an interaction expresses often like the power relations they felt in that moment. They may remember themselves doing things they never did, but like it's the symbolic experience that is like is what's important there, right? What did they pay attention to? What did they not pay attention to, right? And that is actually more, or at least as much as the factual content. That tension is what I'm reading for, right? Because that tells me about what it felt like. Because that feeling is something they are still carrying in their body 20, 30, 40 years later, right? That's what, and like bringing that into historical, like that is historical information also, right?
Interesting. So speaking of collecting historical information, you're also the managing editor for an online journal called RomChip. So how old is that project, and what are y'all aiming to do over there? Also, printing it out.
Sure. I know we do need to print it out. Henry, we need to print it out if you're listening. That's me shouting out to Henry Lowood, one of my co-organizers. So the journal is RomChip, a journal of game histories. And histories was an important word for us because we think there are many histories of games. There is not one history of games. The journal was launched in 2019, so we are in our 6th year now, which is shocking. I think, it was conceptualized maybe going back to like 2015, 2016 by me and Henry Lowood, curator at Stanford. I know, prior guest on this pod, right?
Oh, yeah.
And a guy named Rayford Gwynns, who's done a lot of work on the history of particularly Atari and industrial design. He was also my dissertation, and he was my advisor when I was a doctoral student. And the idea of RomChip is to be it's an online, open access, hybrid audience venue for the publication of games historical research. I think most of those words are pretty transparent, but like, so we're only online, right? We're open access. We have no paywall. You don't have to pay anything to subscribe. The way a lot of academic journals work is that there's subscription fees that are really expensive that libraries have to pay in order for scholars to have access to it. It creates this economy where, you do work, it gets published in a journal, and somebody else has to pay to even read it. We don't do that shit. And we're hybrid audience, which means it's a term we use to say that, yeah, this is, this journal it has academic rigor and includes peer-reviewed articles, but we also invite folks who are not academics to write for us. And we have sections of the journal that are like explicitly for non-academic contributions. Academics contribute to those too, but so we publish transcripts of interviews and oral histories. Probably a third or maybe even a half of those folks are not necessarily academics who do that. We have a section called materials, which is like long essays, kind of like long reads in a pop journalism kind of sense about specific artifacts that related to game history. We also do translations, so we're really interested in translating anything and everything. If it's related to game history, we're interested, and it doesn't even have to ever be in English. You can translate it from Spanish into Japanese, and we'll publish. We don't give a shit, right? We just want more work in the world. We want more people to have access. The reason we did this is because if you're an academic like me, in order to prove that your discipline is a thing, you have to have a dedicated place to publish and to share knowledge, to push the discipline further, and also to have arguments, right? Where we sit around, we fight about the way that we think this should go. There was no journal of game history prior to this. There were game studies related journals. So yeah. Folks doing kind of social science, humanities kind of oriented work related to games, but game history as a dedicated field, if we wanted to publish, we had to either go to a media history journal or a game studies journal. And we felt, let's get everyone in the field feeling like they have a home. And that's what we wanted ROMChip to be. And also, let's get all these other people who are psyched about game history and invested and also want to go deeper than, the top 5 YouTube of the worst enemies in Mario, there's a lot to say about game history that you don't have to be an academic to understand, right? And so our position is also, you shouldn't need a PhD to read or write for ROMChip. We do publish peer-reviewed, very disciplinary articles. They're not for all of our readers, that's fine. But we want everything else in the journal to generally be accessible. One final pitch I'll make here about the journal is that we recently became reader funded. So we were using we were basically funded by our universities for a while, and that's a losing game, especially in our current political climate, right? And it also felt anti-growth. There's never a situation where my dean is going to be like, wow, look at everything, how much you did with so little. Do you want more? That's not the conversation you ever get to have. They're like, would you like less? And I was like, fuck this, man. We want to be able to pay journalists to write for us. We can't ask them to write for free like academics. So, and we would love to be able to run conferences and have scholarships. And so we've turned it over to the people. We're now in our second year of reader-based fundraising. Last year, we almost hit our third tier top, we raised $10,000. With that amount of money, we were able to commission 2 new pieces from journalists, one in Brazil, another doing translation work on some Japanese game history stuff. We've got so much stuff. Cool. Yeah, it's ROMChip is one of my happiest places to be. And our next fundraiser is coming up February 22nd. It'll be a 12-hour Twitch stream. Should I plug the URLs at this point, or?
Actually, okay, yeah. Tell you what, I feel like we could talk This is all so interesting, but it's been about an hour. We'll draw it to a close. I normally ask
I feel
these
like Laine,
questions.
shut up. Like
No, actually, no, not at all. But so I normally ask these questions, like my little softy questions, in the opposite order. But yeah, okay. If people want to find you online, where can you be found? Like, what are the best places to track you down?
Sure. If you just want to know more about my work, you can go to my website, lainenooney.com. I'm most publicly active on Blue Sky, lainenooney.bks, whatever that URL is, right? Just type in my name, you'll find me. That is usually where I'm yapping on the internet. For the journal itself can be found at romchip.org. That's ROMCHIP.org. And if you want to learn more about like our fundraising mission and stuff like that, we have our donor site. We keep it separate from the journal itself. It's called donate.romchip.org.
Excellent. And then the other softy question I normally ask, I'm just curious. So I normally have, this is normally a board game podcast, but you are a digital person. So what is a game that you have played recently that really excited you?
What is a game I have played recently that really excited me? I'll just tell you what I am playing. I'm still stuck in like Act 3 of Baldur's Gate, but that's the most unexpected game I've gotten obsessed with in like the past 2 weeks is Mahjong Soul. So like over Christmas break, a number of friends and we got a Mahjong set and we were playing Mahjong like with the whole tiles and all of it, and we got so into it that now we're like, oh, we got to keep playing Mahjong. Like, and we're like, how do we do that online together? And it turns out Mahjong Soul by Yostar is the way to do that. And it's like wrapped up in one of those kind of like anime panty girl kind of, it's like a lot of that kind of animation. And you're just like, I don't really know what's going on with this part, but I sure do like clicking on these tiles. Okay.
Amazing. Laine, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed this. And everybody out there, please go check out RomChip and all the other projects. Any last thoughts?
No, thank you for letting me talk so much.
No problem at all. All right, everybody. I can be found anywhere online as Beyond Solitaire. I am terminally online, so by all means, reach out. And until then, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.
Game on.